Chapter 5. Set goals and deadlines to guide your work. Some people are so well organized that they finish their home teaching before the 10th of every month. I, ashamedly, am a procrastinator. I do it at the end of the month. And thank goodness someone announced that it needed to be done by the end of every month, because without that deadline, I would keep putting it off until next week. I need a deadline. I suspect, however, that those who get home teaching done by the 10th of every month also need to set deadlines in order to get things done. They just set a deadline earlier in the month. My gas, phone, water, and electric companies, as well as my credit card companies and the Internal Revenue Service, also impose deadlines monthly, quarterly, or annually to be sure that I pay my bills. If they didn't, I would probably keep forgetting to pay them. Goals and deadlines, in other words, help almost all of us do what we need to do. In contrast to home teaching, which has used the last day of the month as a de facto deadline, the member missionary effort has never imposed deadlines. As a result, most of us are not engaged in finding people for the missionaries to teach. Most of us want to be good missionaries, and we intend to start next week. In 1984, Elder M. Russell Ballard challenged us in General Conference to periodically set a date as a goal or deadline by which we would find someone to bring into our homes for the missionaries to teach. He promised us that if we would pick a date and not a person, and then do everything we could to discuss the gospel with as many people as possible, that the Lord would bless us to be able to find someone by that date who would accept our invitation to study the gospel with the missionaries. For some reason, this talk had a powerful impact on me, probably because I was a ward mission leader. I got a strong feeling that this challenge was something that I specifically needed to do. In my prayers that evening, I set a date, conveniently about a year away, as part of this covenant with the Lord. I then committed that I would do all I could to engage in gospel discussions with as many different people as possible, and I restated to the Lord what I understood to be Elder Ballard's promise. The first people I found for the missionaries to teach were the Singleton family. Tom was my basketball friend. The next year I set a date again and was able to introduce a co-worker and his wife to the missionaries. In each of the subsequent years I have set a date in this manner, and in each instance God has blessed me to find someone whom I could introduce to the missionaries. Most have not joined the church. In almost every instance, I could not have predicted who was going to accept the invitation, but I have learned that I can predict with absolute certainty that I will find someone. Can everyone do this successfully? Yes, but there actually is a method to it, which I hope emerges from the stories that follow. On the plane to Hawaii. I had set a date of January 31st, 1993. In typical fashion, early January had come, and I had asked a number of people, but had failed to find anyone who evidenced interest. I was scheduled to travel to Honolulu for an academic conference on January 20th. The way my schedule looked for the rest of the month, it seemed clear that I had to meet the person I could introduce to the missionaries on my flights to or from Honolulu. There was just no other time to do it. So I prayed that God would cause a person who would accept my invitation to hear the missionary discussions to sit next to me on that plane to Hawaii. After all that fervent effort and prayer, I just couldn't believe the person who sat next to me on that flight. Instead of someone who would be interested in a discussion about religion, my seatmate was a 33-year-old man wearing shorts and a loud Hawaiian shirt that was open to his sternum, with thick, curly chest hair billowing out and 3 gold chains around his neck. I tried to strike up a conversation. He told me that he was a stonemason from Hartford, who worked 11 months every year to save enough to escape to Hawaii for a month in the winter to chase women. He then proceeded to tell me how much he enjoyed seeing 4 particularly beautiful women every year when he returned to Honolulu. I was so disappointed. I had tried so hard and prayed so hard to find someone, And instead I got stuck next to a playboy who didn't have a religious bone in his body. Discouraged, I politely wished him a good time and turned to some reading I had brought with me. He rented headphones and proceeded to flip his fingers to the rhythm of the rock and roll tunes that blasted out his ears. When the flight attendant brought lunch around, I had to put my reading away, and I started a small talk conversation with my seatmate. He asked if I had ever been to Hawaii before, and I responded that I had, to attend a 2-month language training school en route to a mission I had served for the Mormon Church in Korea 20 years ago. The man then put his fork down, looked at me, and said, "So you're a Mormon?" I responded that I was, and he said, "You know, the funniest thing has been happening to me over the past year or so. I have just had this growing curiosity to know more about Mormons. I don't know why. Could you tell me a little about your church?" Could I? I then felt something like a cocoon descend and envelop us, and for the next 3 hours we discussed the gospel of Jesus Christ. There was a wonderful spirit there. Eventually we began speaking of other things, and I ultimately excused myself to finish some writing I needed to do. Several times during the remainder of the flight, however, he interrupted me to say thanks for telling him about my church. At his final interruption, I told him that we had missionaries in Hartford, and I was sure they would be willing to visit him when he returned home to explain our beliefs in more depth. He asked if instead there might not be missionaries in Honolulu, so I took his address and promised to have them visit. Ted Blackstone. During one summer vacation to Utah, we had a chance to attend the open house for the Mount Timpanogos Temple. It was a silent walking tour, and the experience troubled me. Our Boston temple recently had been announced, and I could see us walking through it at the time of our open house with friends, unable to say or explain anything as we walked through the dressing rooms, baptistry, and celestial and sealing rooms. I realized that if taking my acquaintances to our open house was my way of introducing them to the church, it would likely just be to them an interesting view of Mormon temple architecture. I resolved at that time that I would set a date early enough in the year 2000 that I could have gone through the missionary discussions with someone before the open house. That way, the open house would be the culmination of a learning experience rather than an introduction to one. I therefore set my date as June 30th, 2000, 2 months before the open house was scheduled to begin. However, as usual, I postponed things for several months and then started desperately inviting all sorts of unlikely people to take the missionary discussions. Then one day in mid-June, a former student, Ted Blackstone, visited me, and as he sat on the couch in my office, I just had this sense that I should invite Ted to take the missionary discussions. He knew a bit about my faith, though I knew almost nothing of his, and had not thought before that he might be someone I could invite. To my surprise, he accepted, and we began the discussions, which were led by a masterful missionary, Jared Sine, and his companions. Little by little, as we progressed through the discussions, Ted became more serious. After a particularly poignant fifth discussion in mid-August, in which I lost my composure inviting him to be baptized, I said, "You know, Ted, if you keep waiting to be baptized until you know for sure that this is the true gospel of Jesus Christ, you may wait for a very long time." I then read him the verse from the Gospel of John that asserts, "If any man will do his will, he shall know of the doctrine, whether it be of God or whether I speak of myself." I told Ted that one of the surest ways he could know of the truth was to commit to be baptized, because this act of doing God's will was the way he could know of its truth. I further asserted that while he could attend the upcoming open house for the temple in September in any event, if he was baptized, he could then attend the temple's dedication as a member of the church. I suggested September 9th. We agreed to fast together the next Sunday to help Ted reach his decision. The next evening, Ted called. He said that his aunt, who lived in Phoenix and had converted to the church many years earlier, had called him saying that she had this feeling that something big was going on in Ted's life, and she wanted to be able to help him. That helped Ted feel that God really did have a personal interest in his decision, and he called me to say that he was going to be baptized. The baptismal service and his subsequent confirmation and ordination were wonderful experiences. On the Sunday he was confirmed, Ted asked Bishop Ott if he could bear his testimony. He said that he had come to realize that baptism was an act of faith, not a step taken based on sure knowledge. Friends subsequently arranged for Ted to have a ticket to be in the celestial room of the temple during its dedication. As President Gordon B. Hinckley was offering his dedicatory prayer, Ted felt a rushing wind come into the room and enter his body, changing his heart forever. Our family had a wonderful experience, too, as our seats in the dedication were in the small preparation room attached to the men's dressing room. Fortunately for us, the Singleton family was there, allowing me to reflect on those wonderful, often tearful testimonies I was able to bear to them as we had participated in teaching them the discussions years earlier. I just couldn't have felt more